Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
I have the immense privilege of inviting my boss, Jeanette White, to engage and tell all of us not only a bit about herself, but how she got in the crazy role of being my boss and directing the Allender Center. But before I welcome you, Jeanette, I have to say that I'm so sad that Rachel will not be here today. She is on a trip with her husband and had anticipated the little cabin that they would be in would have internet that worked. It has internet. It doesn't work. And so it's just the two of us. So sad Rachel can't be here, but so delighted, Jeanette, to have you on this podcast. So welcome.
Thank you. Likewise. And Rachel, we miss you, but I'm grateful to have this time with you, Dan. So glad we can keep moving forward.
And as one person said, Rachel often creates the kindness and priestly presence that sometimes I seem perhaps not to have in the same abundance that she does. So I will try and channel a little bit of Rachel through this process, but it probably won't work out too well. But
it never does, Dan, because you're the prophet, you're the stirrer, she brings the containment and the pastoring.
And we know that only to be too true, don't we?
So true.
So to begin, you are my boss. How, in the name of God, did you get into the Allender Center universe? And how did you come to the position that you have recently taken?
Yes. Oh my. Well, yes, I'm currently the executive director, which I really consider to be a role of service in the form of leadership. You know, I get to support our incredibly talented team and have an eye on stewarding the whole as we seek to continually develop and advance the work that we're doing in the world. And, I've worked at the Allender Center for over 10 years now. Those of you who are longtime listeners to the podcast heard me on some of our 10-year anniversary things, other series. But I have held roles in event and programming management, then moved into oversight over all of our offerings and products and the teams that get to keep those worlds spinning, and also leadership in our overall administration, structures, and finances. So while I didn't start out with the intent to keep moving and growing in my various roles at the center, I like to say it's a bit like having started in the stockroom of a company and slowly making your way into kind of more influential roles as time and experience unfolds. But I think for me, I just continue to love the work that we do, the people on our teams, and those that come to our programming, all of you who are listening right now, I feel at home and inspired and alive here and called to keep moving us forward in hopes of this work getting to reach and awaken more lives to the hope and goodness that this type of story work brings to those who encounter it. So while there was this steady movement of roles and growth over the years, it wasn't so much about ambition for me, but more about showing up to where I feel called to be, where people called and invited me in to be, and to really serve in whatever capacity best supports the center over the years.
All I can say, maybe too loud, too clear, your presence is life-giving. And one of the ways I have seen it is I view meetings as the antechamber of hell. And
I do know this about you.
And yet the meetings you run are I'm not going to say they're a taste of heaven, because I'm not sure that any meeting can ever be a taste of heaven. But they aren't a taste of hell. And
I'll take that.
They're actually, more often than not only helpful, not only thoughtful, helpful, and moves us forward, but there are things that I kind of learn about one another. I learn about myself. I actually learn about our organization because of the way you engage the creation of a meeting. And this isn't about how to create a meeting, but I'm just curious how you do that. And are you aware of that?
That's a good question. I would not say that's something I have spent a lot of time thinking about, other than to say I like and enjoy meetings where people feel connected, have the capacity to voice whatever type of wisdom or thoughts they want to bring, because I feel that infuses and helps the whole of the work that we're doing overall. So I guess kind of a fairly collective approach. And I also like it when we can move the needle on something. We're a high process culture, so we could spend a whole meeting just talking about something, but my goal is often to say, well, what's next? And so what do we do to make that next thing happen, or move that next conversation forward? So seeking to have some effectiveness, I guess, in that way.
But care, true care, as you have often offered for everyone in our leadership team, often slows things down. But moving the needle requires a kind of movement, direction, and directive. Like you hold that complexity incredibly well. How come? What about your life has enabled you to be able to do that?
Oh gosh, Dan, it's hard. I don't come to like immediate stories or things like that. My brain went to thinking about how I've been exploring my Enneagram 9-ness a bit, and how it's just my kind of general, I don't know if you want to call it personality or temperament or those things, is just that I am seeking to find a collective way forward. I am seeking to, I think, honor and hear other opinions, seeking to listen well and see what that is telling us. I wouldn't, I'm not someone who would say I don't know my own mind, but my mind is informed, and the frame shifts and changes as others bring their knowing, their own sense of knowing, their own wisdom, those things to the table. So I don't know if that answers any portion of that question you were asking, but
I'm just curious whether if I had met you at 21, whether or not that would have been true 14, 15. I know you were at 14 or 15 dancing at Disney World.
Disneyland. You're
I'm
right.
sorry.
Yes, our dance team, we would go every summer there when I was 21. So wait, is the question, what would I...
Like you hold incredible complexity with so much care and yet the capacity to move. Like, has that been true of you through the multiple iterations of Jeanette?
That is a very good question. I would say, if I were to look back at myself in college or kind of those teenage years, I never would have expected that I'd be working full-time in a context such as this, focused on healing trauma in particular. I don't know as I ever even used the word trauma or considered it as a category, in my kind of growing up years. And yet I definitely have always been someone who has been, I think, attuned to places where there has been a sense of injustice in some form, whether that's individually, collectively. It's something that I've been attuned to, and I've been a personality that has been able, I think, to kind of hold the multitude of perspectives that might make up those situations. But, I think that I would be surprised but glad to see that I'm a part of something that's doing this kind of deeply meaningful work in the world. I found quickly after what I studied in college, I was in merchandising and marketing and wanted to be a buyer for Nordstrom and those things, but I discovered pretty quickly I was more drawn to work that had a more direct impact on the lives and hearts of people. And I actually left that profession I'd studied for about 4 years in, just because I was feeling drawn to work on settings or work in settings that were centered on shaping and connecting with people's development and growth, which is what drew me. I mean, I started as a student at the Seattle School back in 2007 with you. So I think I didn't know necessarily at the time, but it was what was drawing me into this sort of work, whether it's the work that we do in the world or how we do the work together. I think that, you were a core faculty member at that time when I started, and I actually didn't know your work back then when I started at this school, but I was really instantly drawn into the categories you were teaching on, and they were new to me. They took me a while to understand. I think in some ways, right, I'm still it's just stuff you can keep mulling on and chewing on for decades. But I really resonated with the frame that you brought for how suffering impacts our lives and hearts. And whether it's capital T trauma and abuse or the more nuanced everyday places where life and experiences bring some form of hurt into our lives, how that, and just the way that you talked about how that inevitably shapes us and often distorts us, distorts what we were most meant for. And so anyway, all that to say, with that foundation of intrigue and resonance, I think I met something that sort of was water for my soul of the things that I didn't realize I was wondering about or trying to move toward in the world. And I think getting to sit with that as a student and have it be just learning, I think, about such a rich approach to exploring people's stories, truly tuning into what's happened in their life, why those things happened, and allowing just those really tender and painful places that we often shove under the rug in our minds and hearts to truly be noticed and tended to in a way that really brings good care and capacity to kind of pull us out of patterns and trauma responses. So just we can move towards that greater emotional and relational health in our lives. I think that is what I was always kind of looking for. And again, that can, whether that showed up in a corporate place I was working or in my family or those things, just that's what kind of drew me into this work. There was a coming togetherness there in some ways of experiencing that and getting to have it shape my own life, but then wondering what that means to be involved with a place that is seeking to have that enacted on behalf of others in a bigger way.
Well, I know that feels so true, corporate and systemically, but I'd also say I certainly have been the beneficiary of your Enneagram 9 care, but also wisdom, the ability to read and see systems in operation and dealing with what I would call difficult human beings. Is that a fair beginning?
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, we are a complex bunch.
Yes. Now, and in that, if you take a breath, because I'm going to ask you about your marriage. Your husband, Campbell, is one of the most poetically brilliant. The complexity and goodness, when I think of, if I were to look in a dictionary under the word good, I almost always think of Campbell first. There is a volume, a depth, a breadth of just a good man, but who's also complex, whose capacity to feel deeply and righteously and to, in some ways, I'll say, has porous boundaries that allows the world and people to deeply affect him. So I'm curious, would you agree with what I've spoken?
Yes, 100%. Campbell has been like all like fire since we met. Like he's got such a light.
So I'm curious how your marriage has in some ways prepared you to deal with the complexity of the Allender Center.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that marriage has been one of those places where you learn so much about your own style and capacity for relating in healthy ways, or relating with someone who's really different from you, has different sorts of needs. And, like I grew up in like a warm and present, but kind of rather reserved and not particularly like emotionally or verbally expressive family system when it comes to talking about what's going on inside of us. And Campbell came from a more like kind of bombastic, big, like I always think of that, my what is it? My Big Fat Greek Wedding movie, where you have like the really quiet family that meets, the loud Greek family, and it's just like delightful and but like hilarious at the same time. But just, and yet, they have their own story of the places where, how is our family system supporting each other, each kid, each person has such different needs in those systems. So I think that what came to mind for me when you were asking that question is just, how do you stay engaged and curious and loving and hoping for growth in the midst of a lot of difference? And I think I've kind of lost track of what your original question was, but I think it's that sense of we each are our own unique person, and we bring glory and we bring things that are stunted and hard and clash into each other when you're trying to figure out how to live out a marriage, not only in normal days, but when things get hard or complex or painful in life. And I often talk about with him, I'm like, my whole hope is whether it's in our relationship or like we often talk about it with our son, our 7-year-old son, because, as parents, 90% of your life is talking about your children. But,
yes,
just the hope is to move the needle a bit, right? We may not see a 180 in our lifetime. We may, but we may not. And if we can seek to move that needle a bit in the way that we grow and how we can engage or connect or see one another or offer the necessary care for someone that may not be kind of our natural way of being, that we've done well. And so that's some of the things that come to mind.
Well, it's knowing your husband and the privilege of knowing your son to some degree, you've got a lot of complexity in your life. They are rich human beings with imaginations that I can only to some degree imagine what it would be like to have that kind of imagination and freedom and play. So you're around highly complex, brilliant, good people, both in the Allender Center and certainly in your own family. And maybe it's, again, the same question, but at least asked this way. Like, what do you bring into those plays that moves the needle?
What do I bring into which I think I'm not quite tracking with the question.
Both your marriage and the Allender Center, your family and you move the needle. Like how do you do that, girl?
I see. Oh gosh, it feels hard to answer because I'm just being me, and I think just trying to educate myself and act act in a way that, again, is helping, where I'm getting to become more fully myself, but that is in response to wanting to grow and offer deep goodness for the other, and also in hopes that that obviously circles out and kind of embodies the whole and embodies me as well. I realize that's a bit vague per se. I don't find stories necessarily coming to mind in this moment. But
well, you know that you are a deeply trusted human being. I'm sure there are people in our and other realms that may not trust you fully, like 100%. But I don't know many people who question your heart, your motive, your ambition for goodness in individual and collective worlds. And like there's a grounding in you that we have needed. And in some ways, the original founders, Kathy, me, and others, were entrepreneurs, dreamers, big decisions, quick decisions, and sometimes impulsive decisions without managing or even conceptualizing some of the complexity that we would create in that dreaming movement. There is something about your solidity and your trust. And again, back to that question, has that been true, would friends who knew you in 8th grade, when you were 21, would they come back to say how solid, how trustworthy, like, how come?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say yes. I think I was coming to mind. I've kind of always been the person who's had like maybe it was a group of friends and something happened and factions began, or just like kind of disparate groups of people I'm connected with. I've kind of always been the one who gets along with most or all, and is kind of in between, not because I'm not even seeking to like realign people. It's just that I'm kind of the common thread that kind of keeps the connections together, or those things. So that has been true, I think, throughout my life. And certainly I think that I'm really stubborn, I hope in good ways, in kind of loyal ways. And I'm just a pretty patient person. I think I have a lot of room for people to be people and to have their moments and, or their eras, if you will, and still honor the fullness of who they are. And, so, yes.
Yeah. So you're not undone by messiness, but on the other hand, you're also not indulgent of just imaginative craziness. And that ability to hold those two things in a kind of simultaneity. I just know organizationally, we would have eventually imploded. I'll just speak about myself, imploded in my own erratic, sometimes mania. And that gifting of you have a brilliance of care, a brilliance of capacity to move forward and holding both together. I just think had to have been, shall we say, part of how you engage your own family, how you engage the world that you were in with friendships. So it's sweet to know that we have an 8-year-old and a 21-year-old also working on our behalf. Does that make you laugh?
Yeah. Picturing myself. Like I'm picturing my pink and purple corduroy pants from like 3rd grade. They were amazing. 2 different pairs. One pair was purple. One pair was pink. They were very beloved. Very beloved.
When you think about your fashion sense, because you are a fashionable presence, and I don't mean just in terms of how you dress, but when you think about all the work that you did in that realm. How do you see that playing out in the work as an executive director?
Mm. Well, I think that any sort of work I've been intrigued with is there's sort of a holistic architecture to it.
Mm.
In some ways, like even how I used to want to be a buyer for Nordstrom, right? It's like you have to hold a whole, like just a whole department and think about what's happening with trends and, this and that and all the things and who needs what. How do you serve everybody who's coming in? And just even that sort of picture, like, again, dialing back over 20 years ago when that was kind of my world. But I think I just come at things looking at them from seeking to get as much of a 360 view as I can. And again, that doesn't always come from within me. I'm kind of a learner. I'm an information gatherer, and someone who seeks to synthesize that or invite others to look at that and see what is the synthesis is there. What is that telling us about what we should be doing or where we should be headed. So I think that that's a piece that just comes into the work that I do. I think about like planning a really good Thanksgiving meal, right? It's like you cull through all your recipes, the tried and trues, and the new. I always want to try something, new or those pieces. So I think I'm kind of this balance of like anchoring and also play. Like, how do we do a bit of both in the work, whatever that might be, whether it's work with the Allender Center, the vacation that we're on that we do every single year, but we're going to, mix it up in this kind of a way.
Well, and again, we can say that there have been structures, systems, ways of being in the world that actually, for the current life of the Allender Center, we desperately need and needed. But in that, I also know that if somebody looks, I think they have the ability, like, to look at a name and draw past episodes of the podcast that, we've been together, you and me, Becky and Campbell, talking about some significant traumas that you and Campbell and your family have known. And I'm just, without necessarily going back to all of that, to say, how has trauma, your own, brought you into the work of dealing with trauma from the standpoint of the executive director role?
I think that for most of my prior, like kind of life prior to this season when I began working with the Allender Center, again, 10-ish years ago now, I would say that I faced pretty typical kind of everyday little T traumas that were part of growing up in a world where I had a family system, as I mentioned earlier, was safe and loving, but not necessarily able to meet all my emotional needs, where I'd certainly faced some heartbreak and loss, but nothing that I would have considered like earth shattering. Although, of course, knowing what I know now, all these years later, working in this field of trauma care and the nuances of stories, I don't dismiss those as significant. However, shortly before I started at the center, I did experience an earth-shattering event for my body and heart, which was the first, as we've talked about this on the podcast, as you just mentioned. It was the first of a series of 7 miscarriages that my husband and I faced over a decade-long period together. And so I started this job at the center just 6 months or so into that first loss. And over time, I've experienced the very themes that we teach and talk about, such as betrayal, hopelessness, ambivalence, powerlessness, the coming to fruition in my own life, in one of the most tender places of my story that continues to play out in some ways. These are lifelong, right? Trauma, grief, and loss interplaying in my life. But I don't know what it would be like to not have this frame that we use at the Allender Center from which to really kind of hold on to and understand large aspects of the impact of that particular form of suffering in my life. And, and as you know, in the midst of that decade, I lost my dad very tragically about 5 years ago, and those layers of loss are still with me. So I just think that there's a personal knowing of sorts to how true and meaningful the work is that we do to bring care and tending to wounded places in people's lives.
Yeah. We've done a lot of life together, from our first encounter as you held and managed a trip to Florida, and I think our first, shall we say, very, very small t trauma was we were at a hotel checking to see if we could get lunch there, and as you backed up, a small, somewhat insignificant accident occurred. But nonetheless, it was, shall we say, not the way you would have wanted to begin your travel and work with me and the Allender Center. You do remember that.
Oh, yes. I think we talked about this on our 10-year anniversary podcast. Right? You're like, oh, this is one of my first big trips and my new job. I was like manager of conferences. And then I get Dan Allender into a car accident on the way to the conference, just really rocking it. But I would say, the other day, I was realizing it was right before I started this new role as executive director in January. And the day before, me and my family decided that would be a great day to go and get our COVID boosters. And so we go, and I wake up to the first day of my new job as executive director, and I couldn't even get out of bed. I literally had to call in sick on my first day.
Oh, so appropriate.
I was feeling so terrible. And it was pretty funny to actually look back and be like, oh yeah, your first day, you end up sick in bed. Not what you'd imagine for stepping in with boldness and sweetness into a role, which has been that. But things don't always go as we imagine.
And indeed, to even put it in the same, shall we say, sentence, I understand has a certain degree of failure of meaning, but very small t trauma in that beginning accident to miscarriages and losses, particularly with your father's death, that I have had the privilege of being up close, as many of our good friends in the Allender Center have, to the integrity to suffer, to not minimize, to bear, in some sense, the fruit of death, but not fundamentally with a despair, and yet periods of immense despair, but with that small light toward the end that says death does not get the final word. And I think that has been where I would say, speaking on behalf of those who know you, we trust you. We trust you to enter our heartache. We trust you to believe in the heart of Jesus. And I think that combination is one of those where I know that you are my boss. And we have had our moments of differing on a lot of different issues. And the fundamental stance is, it's not you're the boss, it's you are a wise woman. And I think that sensibility for the Allender Center in the future, I can't honestly believe that there is a better person on the face of the earth to be our executive director. And for many of the reasons that we've talked about today. So honored, Jeanette, to work for you. And I can certainly say, I hope that you will be my boss as I fade further. Nonetheless, the fact is you are someone that I will delight to work with and for decades.
Dan, thank you. Such kind words. I think that it is the trauma that I've been through, in particular, the start with all of our miscarriages, that has allowed like the curiosity and like the attunement that I kind of had all my life to other people's suffering, to kind of sadly like having to enter my own body. But yeah, I am willing to sit in the dirt with pain and suffering, which again comes from really having to wade through it in my own life and just allowing it to be part of the full picture of life that we journey with, versus kind of, I think, again, our culture seeks to like kind of cast off and overcome. And we say, come and sit and be with and let it be part of the whole story. So it really is a privilege to get to work with you and our team. We have such a phenomenal group of people, and to just hear story after story of people whose lives have been impacted by the work we do. Immense privilege.
I say again, on our all behalf, thank you, Jeanette.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.